Are you kidding me right now? Vikings, you just lost your preseason. You just lost your first preseason game to Seattle. We were winning the game in halftime, and then in the second half, you gave it all up. Darn you, Seattle. Darn you, Seattle. Well, now the Vikings play at home against the Tennessee Titans next Saturday, August 19th. And Lord, hope we win. Alright. Stats for the Vikings. Nick Mullins had 14 carrying and 20 attempts and 139 yards and 1 touchdown. Jaron Hall had 6 carrying and 14 attempts and 37 yards. Now to rushing. Ty Chandler had 11 carrying and 41 yards. And Abraham Smith had 7 carrying and 18 yards. And Dwayne McBride had 6 carrying and 15 yards. Nick Mullins had 2 carrying and 9 yards. And now to receiving. Jalen Reagor had 4 receiving and 55 yards. Ty Chandler had 4 receiving and 29 yards. Keneal Harry had 2 receiving and 24 yards. Brandon Powell had 2 receiving and 22 yards. Jordan Addison had 1 receiving and 22 yards. Nick Muse had 3 receiving and 10 yards. Thayer Thomas had 2 receiving and 9 yards. Johnny Munt had 1 receiving and 3 yards. And Nick Muse had 1 touchdown, by the way. And Blake Prowell had, or I don't know what to call it, had 1 receiving and 2 yards. And yeah. Now for the defense for the Vikings. Theo Jackson had 4 tackles and 1 assist. Ivan Pace Jr. had 4 tackles and 2 assists. Jay Ward had 4 tackles and 1 assist. Lewis Sine had 3 tackles. Wilson Huber had 2 tackles and 2 assists. Abraham Bueplan had 2 tackles and 2 assists. Luigi Villain had 2 tackles and 1 assist. Troy Dye had 1 tackle and 2 assists. Caleb Evans had 1 tackle and 1 assist. Curtis Weaver had 1 tackle and 1 assist. Zizi Umatumu, I don't know how to pronounce it, had 1 tackle and 1 assist. Jojion Williams had 1 tackle and 1 assist. Patrick Jones had 1 tackle. Kyra Songa had 1 tackle. Sheldon Day had 1 tackle. Mihai Blackman had 1 tackle. Kaelon Barnes had 1 tackle. Andrew Booth Jr. had 1 tackle. Jonathan Bullard had 1 tackle. William Kikinu had 2 assists. TJ Smith had 2 assists. Andre Carter had 2 assists. Kalen Avery had 2 assists. And Andre Carter had 2 assists. Calvin Avery had 2 assists. And Troy Reeder had 1 assist. Ross Blacklock had 1 assist. And Jalen Williams had 1 interception, which that was nice. Now the kick returns. For the Vikings, Dwayne McBride had 3 returns and 50 yards. Jacob Copeland had 1 return and 17 yards. And a punt returns for the Vikings. Thayer Thomas had 1 return and 0 yards. And for the kicking, for the Vikings, Greg Joseph had made 2 field goals and 100% and 7 points. And for the punting for the Vikings, Ryan Wright had 225 yards. Now for the Seahawks, the passing for Seattle. Drew Lock had 17 carrying and 24 attempts and 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. Holton Howlers had 4 carrying and 4 attempts and 43 yards and 1 touchdown. The rushing for the Seahawks, Bryant Koback had 6 carrying and 32 yards. Holton Howlers had 6 carrying and 26 yards. Zach Charbonnet had 4 carrying and 14 yards. Drew Lock had 3 carrying and 14 yards. So Thompson had 3 carrying and 14 yards. Wayne Talapala had 1 carrying and 3 yards. Cade Johnson had 1 carrying and 2 yards. DJ Dallas had 2 carrying and 1 yards. Now for the receiving for Seattle. Jake Bobo had 3 receiving and 55 yards and 1 touchdown. Bryant Koback had 3 receiving and 43 yards. Matt Landers had 1 receiving and 30 yards and 1 touchdown. Assessip Winston had 3 receiving and 29 yards and 1 touchdown. Jackson Smith and Najuba had 3 receiving and 25 yards. Tyler Mabry had 2 receiving and 15 yards. Zach Charbonnet had 2 receiving and 14 yards. Colby Parkinson had 1 receiving and 10 yards. Wayne Talapala had 2 receiving and 9 yards. Tyjon Lindsey had 1 receiving and 4 yards. Now for the defense for Seattle. John Radigan had 7 tackles and 2 assists. Devin Bush Jr. had 5 tackles and 1 assist. Patrick O'Connell had 4 tackles and 1 assist. Kobe Bryant had 4 tackles. Michael Jackson had 4 tackles. Michael Jackson. Oh. Reminds me of the singer's name. The King of Pop. Alright, let's continue. Jared Creed, too, had 3 tackles and 2 assists. Benji Franklin had 2 tackles. Levi Bell had 2 tackles. Boye Mafi had 2 tackles and 1 assist. Lance Boykin had 2 tackles and 1 assist. Artie Burns had 2 tackles. Tyreek Smith had 1 tackle and 2 assists. Chris Steele had 1 tackle. Jordan Ferguson had 1 tackle and 1 assist. Miles Adams had 1 tackle. Trey Brown had 1 tackle. Christian Young had 1 tackle. Jonathan Sutherland had 3 assists. Ty Okada had 1 assist. Ben Burkiven had 1 assist. And now the kick returns for Seattle. Trey Brown had 1 return and 28 yards. Cade Johnson had 1 return and 17 yards. Punt returns for Seattle. Tyjon Lindsey had 1 return and 9 yards. And Aesop Winston had 1 return. The kicking for Seattle, Jason Blyer had made 1 field goal and had 6 points. And for the punting for Seattle, Michael Dixon had 5 yards and 194 yards. Number 5 I meant, not the yards. He had 194 yards, I meant. Sorry. Now here's the team stats for the Vikings. The Vikings had the total yards. The Vikings only had 248 total yards. And the Seahawks had 332 total yards. In the passing yards, the Vikings had 165 passing yards, and the Seahawks had 226 passing yards. Now the rushing yards, the Vikings only had 83 rushing yards, and the Seahawks only had 106 rushing yards. And the yards per play, Vikings only had 4.0 yards per play, and the Seahawks only had 6.0 yards per play. And the first downs, the Vikings only had 16 first downs, and the Seahawks only had 15 first downs. The third down efficiency, the Vikings only had made 4 third down completions, and the Seahawks only made 4 third down completions. The fourth down efficiency, the Vikings only made 1 fourth down efficiency. Now, well, let's hope the Vikings beat the Titans next Saturday at home in preseason week 3 in the NFL. That would be nice, huh? Yeah. Yep. Go Vikings.